Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me along tonight. I've only got 10 minutes, and there's so much which I could tell you about because we're trying to work on a lot of fronts at the moment. But I've tried to focus on some of the data and some of the learnings which I think could have relevance outside of the Church of England. So if I just share my screen, you give me a thumbs up, Rosh, that's worked. Good, great. So I am focusing today on net zero carbon, but I just wanted, before I dived into that, just to put it in the context that we have a really broad environment programme in the Church of England, and net zero is just one part of that work. It's the bit which is about getting our own house in order. We've got other parts of the environment programme focusing on how we can have a voice into our communities, how we can have a voice through our investments, how we can look after land and nature. Net zero is that very practical bit that says, what are our emissions where we're contributing to climate change and all its terrible effects, and how do we reduce those year on year on year? The whole of the environment programme is underpinned by the fifth mark of mission, to care for creation, although the environment weaves through all of our other marks of mission, particularly around justice. I always think it's really important to start by saying that this isn't just a theory. We have net zero carbon churches now. And what do they look like? They look like other beautiful churches. A net zero carbon church doesn't look like a passive house that's been covered in technology and external insulation. Both of these churches are net zero carbon churches. On the left, St Michael's Baddesley up in Birmingham Diocese, small rural church. What have they done? LED lights, electric pew heating. They're on a green renewable tariff. Then they work out their residual bit of carbon footprint each year and they offset it. They choose to use a Christian offsetting charity called Climate Stewards. On the right, St Michael and All Angel Withington in Gloucester Diocese. The first thing they did was they spoke to their community about whether they could reduce their floodlighting hours, and the community were really open to that. So that cost them no money and it saved them on their energy bills. They've put LED lights through their church. They first tried biomass boiler, but that didn't work out well for them. And they've subsequently moved to electric pew heating. They've got solar panels up here on the roof behind this parapet. The solar panels generate some electricity that's used in the church, and then the spare electricity that goes out to the grid, that acts as a valid offset. So they are a net zero carbon church. We have an energy footprint tool that we make available to all of our churches that enables them to work out their carbon footprint. And we know from that those churches that complete it, 7% of them are already net zero carbon. And for the vast majority of those 7%, it's because they've got electric heating and they're sourcing their electricity from a green energy supplier. So they are net zero. So in terms of our work towards net zero carbon, there were some things going on, and we had the environment programme for several years, but in terms of that focus on net zero carbon, that really began in earnest with the General Synod motion, February 2020, that really importantly put the work in the context of recognising that there's a global climate emergency and that it's a crisis for God's creation and fundamental injustice. And in that context, then called on all parts of the Church of England to work toward reducing their emissions year on year and put a plan in place to get to net zero carbon by 2030. And for all of you joining this session this evening, I'd really recommend starting with a motion by your decision-making body, whatever that decision-making body may be for you in your organisation. But it really has given us a mandate to take forward the work, even though at the time that the motion was passed, it was quite a leap and we didn't have a plan in place. But by stating that prophetic ambition, that intention, it has then brought people along behind it to create that plan. We've done a lot of work since then. There's been a lot of progress since February 2020. We started firstly with defining the scope of that target, consulting on that. So we were engaging around the country, taking that back to Synod, getting that target agreed. We've launched our energy footprint tool for our churches to let them measure their carbon footprint, and then subsequently a whole energy toolkit for our other types of building, because we have schools and cathedrals and theological education colleges and housing and retired clergy housing and offices. We have a very big built estate. We have created net zero carbon guidance and shared it through our website, in particular our practical path to net zero carbon for our churches, which is just a 2-side starter guide for what a church can do. And we've got a self-guided version of that churches can use to get themselves going. We've started our webinar program. We've researched funding. We've put in funding bids. We've worked with the ecclesiastical architects on how they can build environment into their work. We've reviewed our permission rules about what work can and cannot be done in our buildings, and that went to Synod this February and will come into effect in July. Basically, we've moved forward on every front that we could think of. Just to share some of the data that we've learned about our buildings in case they're relevant to you. So we have learned that to get to net zero carbon, we need to really focus on our schools, on our churches, and on our housing. So this pie chart is showing you for our carbon emissions baseline report for the whole of the Church of England that a little bit over half of the carbon from our energy use is from our schools, even though we have 3 times as many churches as we have schools. Then the next biggest slice, unsurprisingly, is our churches, and then it's our housing. And it's really useful for you just to keep in mind that, as a very good rule of thumb, the carbon footprint of a building is related to the size of the building, so the space you're trying to warm, and the number of hours that the heating is turned on. And our schools are pretty big buildings where we're heating them all week long, and to a higher temperature normally, because it's got to be suitable for the children. So that's why our schools have a high carbon footprint each, higher than the average carbon footprint of our churches. We've also realised we need to really, really focus on working out where our biggest, busiest buildings, where we've got the heating on, and try and find ways to proactively support those buildings. So when you look at this graph here, this carbon footprint, you can't even really see the line because it's so small, is the average carbon footprint of one of our smaller rural churches, which are often only heated 2 hours a week, some of them 2 hours a month. The average carbon footprint is tiny. It's 1.4 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. You or I, just living our normal daily lives, will be somewhere between 10 and 12 a year. So our small rural churches are a fraction of that. For a large urban church, it's about 21. But then if you start looking at, we've done net zero carbon action plans for a handful of our very largest, very busiest buildings. For a large primary, it's 66. Diocesan office, a big, busy church, a really big, busy church being used throughout the week to fulfill its mission, 89 tons. Theological college, which is like a, Oxbridge or Cambridge college. But look at this large secondary school. For the carbon footprint of a large secondary school, if you can get one large secondary school to decarbonise, that's the same as 400 of the small rural churches. So what we've really learned is our message to our small rural churches is just maintain your buildings. You don't need to make big changes. If you're already only running your heating 2 or 3 hours a week, just focus on maintenance, fix the broken windows, deal with the worst of the drafts, clear your gutters, fix the roof, make sure you're on a green electricity tariff, and then you're basically there. Where the big projects need to come when we're talking about heat pumps and solar panels, those are on the big, busy buildings which are being used throughout the week. I've been talking a lot about heating, and that's because we know that heating is where we need to focus. We took a sample of our church energy audits and looked at where the energy was being used within the church, and 84% of it was on heating, because these are, large spaces which people are trying to make warm. So we know that that tells us we need to be focusing on how can we reduce heat loss through things like draft proofing and, where it's appropriate, insulation, dealing with windows. It means energy efficiency, particularly around kind of heating controls, lighting controls. And it means have lower carbon heating systems. So moving away from oil and gas based heating. And I love these thermal imaging camera photographs because they bring it to life. This is the bottom of the church door. Blue is cold, red is warm. You can see the cold air rushing underneath this door. So we're talking about simple steps to cut heat loss, like dealing with the problematic drafts. This photograph shows a pew just after 5 people have stood up and walked away. And it really shows you what we know from our own experience. We arrive in the building feeling comfy and warm. We sit down on a relatively cold pew and we put our feet on a really quite cold floor. And by the end of the service, we've lost our body heat into these surfaces around us. So there are simple things we can do around having cushions on the pews, around having runners on the floor that we put our feet on. These things don't cost a fortune. And this photograph just shows a radiator that hasn't been maintained. This radiator can't work efficiently. So maintaining our systems, making our existing systems last as long as possible. So those are the kind of simple things, but then there's heating and tackling heating. And we know that if we're going to get to net zero carbon by 2030, we need to gradually move away from space heating that's being powered by burning oil and gas. We are literally burning a fossil fuel in a cupboard in our building in order to try and keep our buildings warm. And what do those systems have to do? They have to warm hot air that rises all the way up to the ceiling, and then it has to come all the way back down again until it gets to the level where people are benefiting from it. This is the wrong start point for most of our buildings. We need to move away from thinking about heating the building and thinking about how do we make people comfortable? How do we make people comfortable in our buildings and conserve our beautiful interiors? And that means things like pew heating, panel heating, heating cushions, chandelier heating, sometimes for some circumstances, heat pumps, occasionally biomass. The vast majority of the low carbon heating solutions are powered by electricity, which can then come from 100% renewable sources, either by signing up to a valid green tariff or by putting solar panels on our roofs. That's a lot about buildings. But getting to net zero carbon isn't just about buildings. We know that the kind of change that we need involves leadership, it involves engagement, it involves communications. We really encourage our churches to sign up for EcoChurch because it's such a practical framework for making the kind of change across the whole life of the church and engaging the community in why this change needs to be made. We are trying really hard to find case studies. We've just last week before, filmed Giles at his church as a great case study of action being taken. We're trying to find those case studies and share those case studies. We're trying to engage all different kinds of stakeholder groups in what their role can be in moving forward the route map. So all of this work has been captured in our route map to net zero carbon by 2030. How did we get there? We formed a new national committee, which is a subcommittee of our environmental working group, and we made sure that we had representatives of all the key groups, so a diocesan secretary and a diocesan environment officer and our comms team, and all different people, somebody on there from Historic England to bring that perspective, somebody who's an expert from the National Trust. So we formed that committee. We shared the work out of writing the different sections of our route map based on those people's knowledge, and then we put it out really broadly for consultation. That process closed at the end of February. We also got external input from a couple of different consultancy firms so that we knew that we were getting that external input and not just talking to ourselves. We've got it all nearly finalised now, and it will go back to General Synod in July. And that work just gets us to having a plan, and then the real hard work starts. That's it in terms of my slides. So then if we've got, have I left any time? A little bit for questions.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks so much, Catherine. That's really informative. It's great to see all the work the Church of England is doing and all the low-hanging fruit as well, that the simple things that we can do to make a real difference. Does anyone have any questions for Catherine? Please feel free to unmute or just raise your hand. Yes, Giles.
I do. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for that plug. I just wonder whether you were aware of any churches that have done community energy strategies where they work with local people to fund the solar panels or something similar, and whether that's worked or not.
Yeah, so there are a few around the country. So Power Up North London have done that with, I think it's called St Anne's Church. I can think of one in Manchester. There's an organisation, I'll find their name in a minute and put it in the chat. I think it's Power for Good Cooperative, and they've done 3 churches. So there are a few around the country. They were much easier when there was the feed-in tariff. It is more difficult now to get the business case to stack up, but just recently, last summer, Salisbury Cathedral has installed solar panels on one of the stretches of roof of its cloister through a community energy scheme with, I think they're called Salisbury Community Energy. So there's not loads, but there are quite a few.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. Did you have another question, Giles?
No.
Great, John. Thank you. John, did you want to go?
Yeah, thanks. You've given me some really good ideas here, because I play the organ in a big church in Caterham, where the heating is actually up in the roof. It's completely useless, and the decision was made to turn the heating on 10 minutes before the service. So really, it's completely ineffective. What is interesting is if you go over to the church hall on a Sunday morning, it's warm. So I need to start asking questions. Why is that hall so warm when there's actually nobody using it, to my knowledge, apart from a short choir practice and sometimes junior church? So there's a lot of thinking needs to be done. And the other point I want to raise actually is the lack of cash. You know, the church is now struggling because people have not come back. People have died. So it's kind of like everything you ask about, it's always money now. So is there any help on that?
So 2 very different questions there. So one of them, I can't talk about your church in particular, obviously, because I don't know it, but what you're describing with having the heating in the church on at the wrong time, having the heating in the hall on at the wrong time, that's a really common problem that we come across. And one of the simplest things to do is to get your heating controls sorted out. So one of the churches that I worked with in Islington in my previous job, when their heating had been installed, the hall was put on the same loop as the church. So every time they wanted to turn the hall heating on, the church heating on came as well, even though the church was empty. And it cost them a few £100s to get the heating controls sorted out so that then they could run those 2 separately. And simple things like that can save a lot of money and a lot of energy. The second question, so in terms of funding, so there are some things that are just simple and no-brainers, like turning things off when they're not needed, all the kind of basic energy efficiency housekeeping that will save money. Beyond that, for fundraising for grants to do work, I think I put the link in the chat earlier to our fundraising page. There is no simple answer on that. It is competitive, but our churches are remarkably good at fundraising and always have been. If you think back to when the issue, for example, of disabled access first came to people's awareness, and you know, over the years since then, people have worked out what was needed in their building, locally fundraised, found grants, and implemented disabled access. I think Net Zero Carbon is kind of the next wave of work like that, of people at the beginning thinking, right, how are we going to do this? And then having to find ways to engage and find the money. It's not simple, but I have seen it done.
Thank you for your question, John. Does anyone else have any questions for Catherine? Yes, Colette.
Right, who are your key allies, Catherine? Who had to move in order to get other people moving?
Oh, what a great question. So we have an incredibly devolved decision making within the church. So for things to seriously move, you need those different decision making bodies all individually to grasp it and see it as their issue. And I think, like for any organization, if you think back, what, 2 years, 3 years now, the youth climate strikes were incredibly influential. I'm thinking now, and Giles would have been in the meeting as well, we had a meeting of the National Environmental Working Group where the decision was being made about whether to take the motion to General Synod for net zero carbon. And the person who began the meeting read out some of Greta's words to the UN. And once you've heard that, it's very hard to say no. So the youth climate strikes were very influential. Everything, you know, the David Attenborough effect of just increasing people's understanding of the crisis was incredibly influential. I think Extinction Rebellion, like it or not, at that time was incredibly influential in creating that sense of awareness that there was a crisis. Since then, the General Synod motion was very powerful. But the motion that we brought was for net zero carbon by 2045. Making it net zero carbon was one person's amendment. That wave of general support meant that it was passed at General Synod. So one person can make an enormous difference. Beyond that Synod motion, diocesan secretaries for us are very important. Archdeacons are very important. Quinquennial architects are very important. The giving officers in the diocese, our building support officers, our school support officers. So we've been trying to find champions sort of in each of those networks. We have a diocesan environment officer, or we try and have a diocesan environment officer in every diocese. In some places that's a volunteer, in some places it's a member of clergy, in some places it's a paid member of staff. But that network of diocesan environment officers is really important because they are the champion in their diocese. So centrally, myself and my colleague, we do a lot to try and support that network of diocesan environment officers, because having those champions who are engaging in their diocese is so important. That was a very long answer. I'm not quite sure.
That's brilliant. Yeah, we don't have archdeacons in the Catholic Church, but we have everything else. And yeah, I'm one of our diocesan environment leads, not so much because of being an expert, but because of being the justice lead. And it's trying to kind of take on board a whole new strand of sort of practical, technical stuff is really difficult. But doing the finding allies I can do, but it's knowing who to ask. Quinquennial architects, that's been mentioned recently to me, and I don't know much about that.
So once every 5 years, our churches are reviewed for their quinquennial inspection, and normally those reviews are done by one of the ecclesiastical architects. There's a network of them around the country. Sometimes it's by surveyors, but more often by ecclesiastical architects. So we have worked with the Association of Ecclesiastical Architects on some best practice guidance notes for architects on how to build the environment into their QI inspections and how to build it into their project work.
That's helpful. Now I know what people were talking about. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Catherine, for speaking to us about the work of the Church of England.